Welcome to Ali Fitness Podcast, a weekly production all about bringing health into fitness. Phil White is an Emmy-nominated writer and the co-author of Game Changer with Fergus Connolly, Unplugged with Andy Galpin, who we had on the show, and Brian McKenzie, the 17th Hour Fast with Dr. Frank Merritt, and the forthcoming Waterman 2 and Flight Plan, both with Dr. Kelly Starrett. So Phil, when he's not writing, enjoys walking in the woods with his wife and two sons and stand-up paddleboarding to perhaps get away from his wife and two sons. I just added that. I'm not sure if that's true. Phil, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me today. Appreciate it.
Excellent. So I've got so much to talk to you about, but I was excited when you contacted me about your new book that you wanted to talk to us about, because we have a lot of athletes on the show, listening to the show, and I think they would get a lot of benefit from the book. So can you perhaps maybe just give us a brief summary of Fergus's background and what compelled you both to write the book and who your target audience is?
Yeah, absolutely. Fergus is kind of unique. He was the first full-time sports scientist in the Premier League back with Bolton Wanderers many years ago now, and big Sam Allardyce when he was just kind of getting started in the Premier League as a manager. And then from there, he's really the only person to work in either a performance or sports science role with every major field or court sport in the world. So he's done some stuff with Clarko and those guys, Aussie Rules down in Australia. He spent time with several of the New Zealand All Blacks coaches. He actually consulted with Eddie Jones the weekend before he started in his new role at the time of head rugby coach. Fergus was also with the Welsh national team as the director of performance for them for 2 years. And then most recently, he's been in the States. And so he was with Coach Jim Harbaugh at the 49ers in the NFL. And then most recently, it has been with Jim again at University of Michigan, and has also done some consulting with NBA teams here. And so really he has this breadth of experience across all of these different sports. And when he studied under some of the great coaches in history like Vita Frade in Portugal and the Canadian sprint coach Charlie Francis, what those guys really impressed upon him was the need for principles and to really create a model for preparing coaches and athletes to win individual and team sports. And really what Fergus is doing differently is he's created this athlete health centered model where that has to be the foundation for everything. And we see a lot of the higher levels, whether it's in college sports in the US or pro sport around the world, that players get chewed up and spit out. They have very short careers. And part of the problem is that the teams will just squeeze every last ounce out of these guys and girls and then just kind of leave them on the scrap heap and move on, because there's always, 10, 20 people, 30 people behind them in each position to step into their shoes. And really Fergus's point is, well, if you want longevity, as a coach, you have a responsibility to take care of your athletes. And that really starts with athlete health. And that was kind of one of the main motivating factors to write this book and maybe redress the balance a little bit between that meat grinder versus, again, creating athlete health and longevity over the long term, even beyond their playing days.
I love that you write about the structuring playing development with a new, like that holistic approach about athlete health first and also reducing the risk of injury. I guess to me, that just seems like common sense, but isn't that not common sense for coaches?
No, I think that another different thing about Fergus's model is that he says that you have to develop technical, tactical, psychological, and physical characteristics all at once at all times, which was another thing that he learned from Vita Frade, who influenced Jose Mourinho and all of the great kind of class of Portuguese managers that we see be so successful around the world. And again, folks like Charlie Francis. And I think in sport today, almost any time a coach finds a fault with an athlete, they try to make that into a physical issue that can be solved in the gym. Well, a American football player, wide receiver, dropped the catch because he can't jump high enough or he can't run fast enough. Oh, let's have him do more cleans, more plyo in the gym, let's get him out there on the track. And sometimes this leads to just a more approach. And then when you add in this kind of focus on stats and big data and everything, whether it's, I remember even maybe 10 years ago when the Champions League in footy, when they started having stats on how far a player ran during a game or how many tackles they made and tried to extrapolate that to effort. And so we're kind of stuck in this race of more, and also trying to fix every problem on the field or in competition through the physical realm. Whereas to Fergus's point, maybe it was a tactical problem. Maybe say if it was in American football, a player didn't understand the play and so they couldn't get to the spot where they needed to be to make that catch. Or maybe it's a technical issue. There's something wrong with their technique. And then, going back to the psychological, maybe they made a crucial mistake in the cup final last year, and that's kind of haunted them ever since. And it's a mental issue. And so really to improve player health and create this kind of longevity, we need to look at these three other elements, the technical, the tactical, and the psychological, and really start to see how we can make some improvements there and just stop hammering athletes from the physical standpoint and just expecting them to do more all the time, because that isn't sustainable for anybody at any level.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the importance of that simultaneous development. How would you go about that as a coach? How do you try and define what it is? What area? Is it tactical? Is it technical? And then how would you go about sort of developing those traits simultaneously?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that Fergus does is to break the game down into 4 particular moments, and really every occurrence or event within team sport happens within one of these. So obviously the 2 simple ones are offense and defense, but then there's also the transitions between the 2. So to start with that kind of lens and figure out what part of the game are we looking at here. And then from there, just to take a snapshot of the event. So really look at what happened. And again, look at it within the context of a game, because obviously a player taking free throws, say in basketball at the end of the game, or, say there's 1.2 seconds on the clock. And if he makes one, then it's tied. And if he makes the second one, then his team wins. Well, if he blows both, they lose the game. Obviously, the psychological aspect there is different to, 2 minutes into the first quarter when he's on the line. There's no real pressure from a mental standpoint. And so to really look at the type of game moment again, so offense, defense, or the 2 transitions between those, and then to look at the context of that moment and see if there's anything, with regard to the impact of what that action, the successful or unsuccessful completion of a skill will lead to and the ramifications of that. And then to really just break it down. So, if you're looking at a certain action and it's obvious that, maybe you look at the injury history as another way to bring in context. So in this case, it may be a physical thing. Say if a player in American football fails to make a block on the line and the quarterback gets sacked, well, maybe the lineman that blew that assignment is coming back from a hamstring pull and he was just brought back too early. So in this case, obviously, it would be a physical thing. But if the player hasn't been injured, has been with the team a long time and seems to know the playbook, then we can start to narrow down which of these 4 elements, technical, tactical, psychological, or physical, it may be. And so really what you're doing is working backwards from the game itself, which again is something that typically hasn't been done in sport. What we've typically done as coaches and as performance specialists is to build upwards to the game, and almost everything is through the lens of training. Whereas Fergus is saying, let's look at what's actually going on in the game itself. Let's isolate that moment in time, see which of the 4 game moments it occurs in, look at the context, and then you can start to work backwards and do that detective work. And then really, again, to set up realistic situations in practice. So, for example, the great legendary UCLA basketball coach, John Wooden, back in the day, he would have his players shoot free throws when they were at their most fatigued during practice. And his reason for doing this was because that most closely mirrored the point in the game, i.e. the end of the game, when making free throws was most crucial. And it also just any point in the game, a player's been running up and down for a few minutes, they get fouled. Okay, well, now they have to go to the line and take free throws. And so John Wooden was a great example of how to set up a practice situation that is very realistic to the game. Or say a kicker in rugby or in American football, you also want to look at the volume of those kicks. And so say a kicker missed, 3 penalties in rugby. And, well, that obviously could be the difference between winning and losing at any level. Well, you wouldn't want that player to, up until now, what has been done is kind of a high volume fix. Well, in practice, he's not going to practice with the main team. He's going to be off to one side and we're going to have him take 100 kicks and he has to make at least X percent of them. Well, that's not very realistic to the game, is it? Because the kicker, whether it's down bigger for Wales or whoever it is, would never have to take 100 kicks in the game. So instead, let's have him practice with the rest of the team, go through the motions with everybody else, and then periodically we'll pull him aside. We'll have him take a couple of kicks while he's under a bit of a fatigue load as he would be in the game. And then we'll put him back into the regular practice. And so again, once you've kind of identified the problem, narrowed it down to technical, tactical, physical, or psychological, then what we're trying to do is create a practice scenario that is realistic to the game and involves the player executing a skill with a similar kind of volume as they would be in the game. And so that's kind of the process.
I like that idea of working backwards, and you talk about that in the book. You've got a goal or the game in mind. What if there's several games? It's not just like an A game here. It's like there's several games or several goals that the team want to achieve over the time.
Yeah, I think you need to simplify it. And I think that Fergus is speaking this weekend at the MIT Sloan Sports Conference. And obviously the key there is big data, and almost everyone there will be very pro data collection and putting that to work. And with the success of the book and the movie Moneyball, we saw that came to the fore in baseball and then started to trickle into other sports. But I think that the problem is sometimes that we get so focused on quantitative analysis, so pulling hundreds of data points, and we run the risk of, again, not putting that into context with what the eyes see and a qualitative analysis, which you really need to pair the numbers with. And so even I was talking with a friend about this last night. There's a couple of new books out that focus on the Golden State Warriors, or at least mention them. And they talk about how their success the last few years has been largely predicated on analysis. But that kind of runs contrary to what I've read, particularly with regard to Steve Kerr and his coaching staff. And when Kerr came in, he did identify a number, but it was a single number that he wanted the team to target, as you mentioned, across several games, and in fact, every game. And that was simply he and the coaching staff up there in Golden State coming in, obviously a new staff, had some great players in Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, but hadn't really reached their potential. They realized that there wasn't enough ball movement. And so they thought about which statistics might be fitting for this, and they came up with a single one. And it was just the total number of passes per game. And so Kerr said early on, okay, we want a minimum of 300 total passes per game. Now they're collecting hundreds, if not thousands of data points, with these new kind of 3D tracking things in the arena that are up high with the cameras and sometimes wearable sensors and this kind of thing. But really what they realized is that to fit in with Steve Kerr's coaching philosophy, which he was asked to define that in one word, and he said joy. And to play joyfully, he realized players need to share the ball. And then he connected the dots to, okay, if we're going to use some of this analysis stuff, let's just go with passes a game. And really what that came down to was starting with a coaching philosophy, which again, he encapsulated with the word joy, and then drawing a line between that and the number that would probably correlate to his team moving the ball, which would make everyone feel more involved. And you really do see that joy with which Steph Curry and those other guys play and have played the last few years. And obviously the success beating the Bulls record, multiple championships. So really it starts, I guess, with the philosophy that you want to put into place, and then figuring out, are the stats, are the measurements that would fit within that. But it really all starts with first principles.
I'm glad you mentioned the Golden State Warriors, because I'm interested to get your opinion about Steve Kerr's recent coaching style, where he actually got the team to coach. Did you see that game?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, and I actually was just this morning watching tape of the Warriors-Clippers game from 2 nights ago, I think it was. Yeah, it was last night, while I was doing some Kelly's mobilizations there on the old mat. And yeah, they were talking, Reggie Miller and Kevin Holland, the commentators, were talking about that. And Reggie said, really, it comes down to finding any way to continue motivating a team that has been so consistently excellent over the past few years. And obviously he said, well, Steve Kerr was on those great Michael Jordan teams with the Bulls and knows how hard it is to motivate a team for, back-to-backs and three-peats and this kind of thing. And so, yeah, a lot of people thought that was a gimmick or he was abdicating his authority or whatever, but I thought it was kind of cool. And I also thought that players like Andre Iguodala, who have been in the league for a very long time, are very experienced. A guy like that knows the system, and the Warriors play a pretty simple system. Again, it comes back to trying to live out that principle of joy and a couple of others that Kerr and the coaching staff have, and seems like a pretty good leader. Here was a guy that was willing to accept coming off the bench for the first time in his career a couple of years back, and was rewarded with the team not just winning a championship, but the very odd thing of basically a bench player being named as the NBA Finals MVP. So he's really bought into this sharing first mentality that the Warriors have. And I think is one of those older players in the league you look at and think, man, that guy's going to be a great coach someday. So why not have Iguodala run a couple of plays in the huddle, or a vocal leader like Draymond Green? And so I think that whether it's, I hate to say it as a long-suffering Dallas Mavericks fan, but whether it was Tim Duncan for Greg Popovich back in the day, I think Duncan would have done a great job running the huddle and would probably be a good coach going forward. So when you get that kind of great player and great coach relationship, whether, again, Duncan and Popovich at Spurs, or dare I say it for non-Patriots fans, Tom Brady and Belichick in New England, or even someone like Ryan Giggs for Alex Ferguson back in the day at Manchester United, I think that the wavelength is pretty similar between those coaches and their longtime players. And so really, if the players couldn't coach a game, I think you have a problem, frankly. Because I think they don't understand the game plan, they don't understand the commander's intent, and they don't understand the principles. So the fact that they were able to go out and do that, I think, wasn't just a gimmick. I think it was a reflection of how good the system is. It really was an extension of when Steve Kerr was out, obviously those horrible complications from his spinal surgery that went wrong. And Luke Walton, with zero head coaching experience, came in and coached them to the best first half record in NBA history. And that isn't to say that Luke Walton isn't a great young coach, because he is. But again, it's the system. The system and the principles are solid. That's just a reflection of that, really, I think.
Interesting. And then you mentioned just now about data and how there's a lot of, I guess, quantitative assessments going on. So in the book, you talk about qualitative lens and using and saying that must be used if quantitative assessments are going to positively affect the scoreboard. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and so really what we're saying is this number or set of numbers that you're looking at in any way related to positive outcomes on the pitch? And so, for example, going back to what I said earlier about that Champions League stat of how far a player ran during a game, and, he's one of the hardest working players in La Liga or the Bundesliga or, Premier League, whatever, because he ran a long way. Well, if a player literally positioned himself at the center circle and just ran around in a circle the entire game, I'm going to guess he would probably rack up more total meters than anyone else on the pitch, but he wouldn't have affected the scoreboard in any way. Or similarly, I think it was Schneiderlin when he was sold from Southampton to Man United a couple of years ago. One commentator made the case that because he, I think at the time, was averaging the most tackles attempted for any midfielder in the Premier League, that he was one of the most industrious players at that position. Well, I contrast that to the great Paolo Maldini, obviously AC Milan, Italy captain. It was very impactful in world football for almost 20 years. And near the end of his career, Maldini was only averaging 1.8 tackles a game. And the stats movement was just starting to gain momentum. And an interviewer was kind of puzzled about this and asked him, shouldn't you be doing more tackles a game if you're really this hardworking defender? And Maldini kind of just smiled, and through a translator, he said, well, if I'm in the right position, why would I need to leave my feet? Why would I even need to tackle? And so really, his point was that a lot of defending that people may not realize has very little to do with tackling itself, but it's the positional sense that at age 38, 39, he knew the game so much and knew his role in the team so much that he would prevent having to leave his feet and make a tackle, which obviously if you miss the tackle, then the striker could be clear through on goal, by just being in the right position. And also as he started to slow down late in his career, he didn't have the legs that he did as a younger man. And so didn't really have the capacity to chase down or run away forward. And so again, just positional awareness was one way that he overcame that. And that kind of positional awareness really comes into the maturation of an older player's game in any sport and really starts to speak to that psychological maturity and that technical and tactical awareness that can sometimes help a player extend their career. And so really, when we start to talk about qualitative analysis, that's the kind of thing we're talking about, the kind of thing that doesn't show up in the stat sheet. And I guess some people would call intangibles, really, whether that was with Maldini or someone like Draymond Green for the Warriors or someone like David Campese, of course, the rugby great from back in the day, just had amazing positional awareness. And that's a qualitative thing that goes beyond, oh, how many tackles did they make? How many meters or yards did they run?
I like that comparison in the book, and the fact that you mentioned the media often like to tap into this quantitative assessments, don't they?
For sure, yeah.
It sounds better. A couple of things you've mentioned, Phil, with regards to principle. You keep coming back to the simple principle. What do you mean by the simple principle?
Yeah, and so really, again, with the Warriors, when Kerr was asked about, what are some of your main principles that the team is founded on, and it just any interview I've seen with him on this, it just comes back to that one word, joy. He wants them to play joyfully, and he thinks that in doing so, that will take advantage of those high-scoring players they have in Durant and Klay Thompson and Steph Curry. Moving the ball again will create a kind of, as Reggie Miller said on that broadcast I mentioned, the sharing is caring kind of cliche, but it's true, where the ball moves a lot and you try to find the best shot rather than one guy trying to put up 50 points in a game. Really, it starts from a set of very simple principles, or certain teams in the past, for example, the Detroit Pistons, the bad boys that frustrated Michael Jordan for so long, they were kind of defined by toughness. If they had used one word, it would be toughness and grit, and were just very rugged defensively, and that enabled them to win 2 championships. And so if you look at some of the great teams, maybe flow would be a great way to describe the Brazil team of Pelé and some of those other great players. I think that too often we get lost in the nitty-gritty of complexity and of trying to create these horrendously complicated training plans, particularly from a physical standpoint, and introducing all these wild new exercise of, because LeBron, there's a picture of LeBron balancing on a Bosu ball while he's doing a single arm kettlebell press or something like that, then we should be doing that. And it's like, well, number one, you're not LeBron. And secondarily, that doesn't necessarily work. And, even I interviewed Nick Gill, and Gilly is if an Australian can even tolerate me saying this, is the strength and conditioning coach for the All Blacks and has been for a long time.
We're going to have to end the podcast.
Cut it off,
we'll definitely edit that out.
But he was talking about, even in the physical training of players, that a lot of coaches get stuck in using variety for variety's sake. And he said that, number one, when you change up an exercise, that it introduces a new stress load that can make the players stiffer and more sore. And then secondarily, there's the potential for injury. And so really what he does in the weight room is, sure, they'll do, say with the squat, they'll do some box squats, some goblet squats, some back squats, some front squats. And so they'll have some variety there, but they're all centered around that kind of core staple exercise that stood the test of time for so long, the squat. He isn't having a guy balance on a Bosu ball on one leg and press an oddly shaped weight with the other arm, that kind of thing, because it was on some player's Instagram video. Or sometimes we go through these fads in exercise where even at the highest level that it will start to trickle down to that. But Gilly's point was, look, we know what the guys need to be doing, and it's nailing the basics. And then occasionally we'll add in some variety from there. But even from the standpoint of being able to benchmark performance over time, if you're having the guys do, or the girls do, some squats, some pull-ups, some deadlifts, some of the simple stuff, and their technique is right and they're nailing it, you can start to see the progression over time. And you can also start to see on days where maybe you overloaded their training a bit too much and they're struggling to recover. So maybe you dial it back. And so that was a really good conversation with Gilly in general. But I think that his points hold that, we need to nail the basics. And that's the same with those principles. So the Golden State Warriors, joy. The Detroit Pistons back in the day, grit. The Pelé Brazil team, flow. You can really start to, if you start simply and you stick to the same principles game to game, all you have to do is slightly vary your tactics based on your opposition. But regardless of who they're playing, the Warriors still want those 300 passes a game, or now I think it may be 30 assists they're averaging per game, which is unheard of in the NBA. And so if you can start simply, if you can have principles that are consistent game to game, and you just have to adapt a little bit based on game-by-game tactics due to how your opponent wants to play and what you want to take away from them, then really you're going to find that kind of consistency that the Warriors have, that the Spurs have had over the years, that those great Manchester United teams had, and you're really going to find something that's systems-based and is repeatable season after season, and that is what leads to sustained excellence.
Yeah, and you write about that the most effective coaches and even military commanders never give their players or soldiers more than 3 aims, or I guess 3 goals for the competition or the battle at hand. Is that because they're males and they can't handle more than 3 instructions, or is there a...
Could be. No, I think it's, well, to your point, though, it is a psychological thing that the player needs to focus so much on the chaotic environment of the game. And, with the military, obviously, the old cliche is that no plan survives contact with the enemy. And so whether it's, say, in the FA Cup recently, there were a couple of upsets there, as there are every year, or I guess for fans of college basketball, the NCAA tournament, or even in the Rugby World Cup, we saw South Africa get upset early in the rounds last time. The players, there's so much chaos within the game scenario in any game, regardless of whether you're the worst team in the world or the best team in the world, that they need all of their energy to be able to focus on adapting to that. And if you're filling their head with too many, oh, wait a second, the coach said I should have done that. Oh, no, I should have been over here. It can really start to slow down their instinctual decision making and everything you've been trying to build during these hours and hours of practice and game time preparation. And so, yeah, you're right. Really, you want to keep the commander's intent in mind, and you want a couple of sub-objectives. But beyond that, it's going to be too psychologically taxing, which is then going to slow down skill execution to the point that the players just aren't going to be as effective as if you had just given them more simple instructions.
Look, I love the book and I love all the examples that you give. Who's the target audience for the book?
I think anyone involved in team sports, whether it's coaching, backroom staff, or athletes themselves. And then secondarily, there are things in there that apply outside of sports. And so even for me, Fergus and I had a chat partway through, maybe halfway through this book, about just my work habits. And I tend to go hard and fast. And in liking that speed and liking being able to put down quite a few words every day when I'm able to create a focused work environment, I can be my own worst enemy with that. And in terms of recovery and the quality of that work. And so really, I started to adopt some of the principles that Fergus was talking to me about in my own work. So, for example, yesterday was a very heavy day of interviewing. Fergus and I are working on our next book, which hopefully you won't mind me saying is going to be some variety of game changer legends and the lessons really that he learned, kind of his on-the-job apprenticeship from some of the best coaches working with some of the greatest players. We did a couple of hours of interviewing. I do some blogging for the likes of TRX, the fitness equipment company, and some others. And really, I was just on the phone most of the day. And so I knew today I was going to get up a bit later, which I'm not a very early rise, to be honest, because I like to write at night quite a bit. And so that was quite a late start. And I thought, I take the Warriors game so I could fast forward the commercials. I'm sore as heck from lifting the last few days and from going down a pretty vicious sledding hill here in Colorado with my kids over and over. And so I'm just going to chill for an hour and a half or so, drink some coffee, mobilize, watch a bit of that game. And really this speaks to what Fergus talks about when he's talking about managing load and kind of managing volume, intensity, density, and collision across the days in a training program. And to me, that applies to my work. And when I step back and look at a week and I know I have, like I said, a heavy day of interviewing, and particularly if I tag on a few hours of writing at night after that to write up some of those interviews, then I'm just going to be smashed the next day if I go and do exactly the same thing. So I try to not have back-to-back days of 6-8 hours of interviews. And if I do, I'm going to build in some extra recovery and have a couple of lighter days on the back end of that. And I found that my productivity has gone way up. I feel better, I sleep better. And so really, I think these principles and these models do apply in the world of work and setting better boundaries in your personal life. So really just anyone that's wanting to have a high level of performance sustained over time.
And talking about that high level of performance over a long period of time, I wanted to ask you about the 17-hour fast. So that book, is it true that this was based on what you did to help your co-author, Dr. Frank Merritt's best friend, fight cancer?
Yeah, and so I wasn't connected with Frank at the time when this situation arose. If anyone listening has read my book with Andy Galpin and Brian McKenzie, Unplugged, they'll have come across Frank Merritt. He's featured pretty heavily in this book, has been a big influence on Brian McKenzie the last couple of years and on me as well. And so I got connected to Frank for Unplugged. And in the course of that, we started talking about some of the things that he does and his experience. And so by day, he's actually an ER physician down in Florida, busy hospital down there. And by night is kind of a self-trained exercise physiologist and is board certified in internal medicine. So of course, he does know all about the various energy pathways in the book to a high level. So his best friend, Jason, was, as you said, was diagnosed with the most aggressive form of brain cancer several years ago now and was given no more than 6 months to live. And so Frank got together with a team from his hospital and just his network of everything from psychologists to endocrinologists and basically any ologist you can think of in the medical sphere. And they came up with several protocols for this friend, Jason, and managed to help him outlive that prognosis. And though he did actually succumb to the cancer, sadly, after 7 years, he was able to have 2 kids with his wife at that point, which, you know, the oncologist had said at one point probably wouldn't be possible because of the effects of the treatment, the traditional chemo treatment, and was able to practice law almost right up until the end and have good quality family time and time with friends. And so one of the parts of that protocol that helped keep Jason alive longer and give him back some quality of life was fasting. And we know that from the literature that certain types of cancer really feed on glucose. And so starting to restrict your sugar intake at a certain point can really slow the spread of those cancer cells. And then there are other effects in the body. So even I think everyone listening has probably had a friend or family member who has experienced cancer or is going through cancer and their life has been touched and impacted in some way by that. But then if we look at the other great health challenges in Western society right now, you know, I think a lot of them are metabolic diseases, heart disease, high blood pressure, hypertension, that whole kind of nexus of evil, as it were, around health can be traced back to a lot of the time to diet. And even within the sports community, you know, we find a lot of these endurance athletes are pretty much hooked on sugar and have been told by their coaches, you know, oh, you've got to get something into you. You know, you even see in marathons and this kind of thing, guys sucking down Gatorade or goos and gels every 20, 30 minutes because there's this fear if you don't keep topped up with this simple sugar energy that you're going to bonk and you're going to crash. It's like, look, the liver is capable of obviously producing glucose, but it's also capable of producing a combination of glucose and ketones to keep you fueled over the longest way. And so what we've got here basically came up with this protocol that's backed by science, and we're not trying to sell somebody a line of supplements, which sadly I think a lot of these kind of books do. And we're also not saying that you need to be on a paleo diet or you need to be on a ketone diet or whatever it might be. Really just trying to help people hit a reset button a little bit and maybe be a bit more resilient where they're not having to top themselves up with sugar all the time. And in doing so, that if they are struggling with a health problem that is in some way related to their diet, that even just doing this fast once a week can maybe help them to start re-examining their relationship with food, which through the convenience of drive-through windows and 24-hour stores and everything else may have become something that it shouldn't be, and to, again, hit that reset button so that they can then start to improve their health by slowly starting to tweak their diet.
And Phil, why the magic number of 17?
Yeah, and that might seem a little arbitrary or gimmicky, but it isn't. I mean, it's just the work that Frank and that team of specialists did over the years to figure out, okay, what is an obtainable number one, for people just starting off with a fast? And really what they started to see was that if you eat a normal dinner, say between 6 and 7 p.m., and then don't eat again until lunchtime the next day, that you're asleep for a lot of those hours, hopefully. And that for in terms of E is that you're not going to have success in any program or system if you don't have adherence. And if something is too unpleasant, you're not going to get people to stick to it. And so the fact that you're asleep for a pretty big percentage of that time helps with adoption, helps with people who are used to snacking every hour or two and, couldn't go out with you. Sometimes we've had friends or family members go out on a hike with us and like, oh, did you bring a granola bar or something? I'm starving. You think you only just ate breakfast right before we left. If you can tailor your pre and post meals, maybe cut them down to 3/4 or half the normal size, in a combination of kind of bookending that with that 17 hours, it starts to give you some of the metabolic benefits of a longer fast, of a 24 or a 36-hour fast, but without that kind of unpleasantness factor that some people do run into when facing those longer fasts the first few times. And quite frankly, what we found is that often they end up quitting and just not repeating it because it feels too unpleasant.
Excellent. Well, we'll include a link to the book in the show notes as well. I'm also fascinated in a book that I believe hasn't come out yet but is on its way out. You're doing a book called Flight Plan with Dr. Kelly Starrett, and I definitely want to get you on the show before or when that comes out. But can you give us a little bit of a background about that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's partly that Kelly, in building his movement and mobility system, which shameless plug alert, you can find at mobilitywod.com, and it is pretty accessible, whether it's you're an athlete or just somebody that wants to be able to move better and have that full human capacity. It's pretty easy to get started with just a few minutes a day of his mobility work. But so in building this thing up, and he was basically the go-to guy for CrossFit for mobility and movement for 10 or 12 years. He was for a long time flying around the world doing that himself before he got some other folks like Danny Matta and Travis Stewart on his team. And so he realized that really traveling would throw off his regular patterns, and he would find himself doing things on the road and justifying that by, oh, well, I'm just traveling, when I get back home, I'll do it differently, or I'll go back to what I'm doing. So whether that was eating or drinking habits or sleeping and this kind of thing. And he also knows a lot of other people that travel an awful lot and rack up multiple 100,000 miles a year and have, lifetime platinum status with all these different airlines. And he saw that some of those that traveled the most are actually traveling the worst. And really what you're encountering is this toxic environment at the airport. There's the stress of security, there's the bright lights, there's the noise, there's the crowds. It's a very stressful environment, let alone if you're afraid of flying, which obviously would just be compounded then. And then in the airport, unless you can afford a flatbed seat, you are stuck in this crappy position in a seat that is not conducive to any kind of proper positioning. And so then you're running into that. Then obviously there's the effects of jet lag to factor in and all the other stuff on the back end. And then even just the emotional effects of people, the kind of road warrior types that are leaving the house early on a Monday morning and not coming back till Friday and leaving family behind, or members of our military who are deployed overseas for long periods of time. And basically the conclusion Kelly came up with is, look, everyone who flies does it badly for the most part. And some of the people that do it the most do it the worst. And so what can we come up with in terms of this 14-step protocol to help you not just survive, but thrive in the airport, to be able to get out the other side at your destination without feeling like you've been hit by a train in terms of the effects of that seat, to start to overcome the jet lag and sleep a bit better. And so really, whether you're going on holiday and you want to be able to have the most fun you can, or maybe you're presenting at a conference or something like that, or to your boss, and you have to be on your game when you get to your destination, or anything in between. Maybe you're a pilot or an air stewardess or whatever it is, or steward, and this is a regular thing for you, and your sleep's been in the toilet for years, and your circadian rhythms are all over the place. So really, what are this set of protocols? So little nutrition, little mobility, little sleep hygiene you can start to do to just travel better and not just survive it, but to thrive.
Awesome. A lot of our listeners are big time travelers, and some are even pilots. So that is going to be very interesting. So keep us updated with that. I'm conscious of your time, Phil, but before I let you go, I wanted to ask you a personal question. Do you have a tattoo?
I do not, no.
Have you considered it at any stage?
Not really. I look at certain NBA players who have gotten them over the years who probably shouldn't have. And I don't know, I think I might be in that category of later life tattooing that wouldn't really work. And also I think that certain people can pull them off better than others. If you look at someone like The Rock, I think could pull off a tattoo pretty well. I think I might be on the opposite end of that scale. So yeah, I'm not against them by any means. I just personally don't think it would look that good on me. So yeah, that's why I haven't.
Fair enough. Look, thanks again for coming on the show, Phil. And we will include all the links to the books, social media, ways to contact you, and we'll put all that in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation and appreciate you having me on, taking the time to talk to me today.
Excellent. For all the resources and show notes from today's episode, please go to www.ally.fitness. If you liked today's episode, please show your appreciation by going to iTunes, give us a 5-star review and subscribe.